unless you're actually going to say something. Thanks. Deb, I do just have to ask you to tell us who sent apologies.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that, Meg.
You just have to ask you to let us know who has sent apologies.
Yes, okay. Hold on. I've got apologies from Jane Backhouse, Phil Carradine, Francis Casey, Janet and David Cragg, Sue and David Eagle, John Gillam, Jeremy Lawson, Nikki McLaughlin, Sinclair Rogers, Enid and Adrian Wells, and David Worthington. Some of those weren't sure, said they might be able to join partway through the meeting. Frances Casey, I think I should mention this now, is off receiving her PhD today, which is a very good. Yeah. And when you consider the ill health she's had, I think it's wonderful that she's achieved that.
I'll send her a congratulations from all of us, shall I?
Yeah, and we're hoping to have, because her thesis is vaguely Sassoon relevant, we're hoping to have a summary of it in the next journal or the one after that.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Well, as you know, we didn't have an AGM last year, so I haven't seen some of you for 2 years. Welcome back. We had hoped, I suppose, that by now we would have been a little bit further towards a real meeting in the flesh, but it's good all the same that we can have these Zoom meetings. This, of course, will be Deb's last appearance as secretary, though she's promised that she's going to go on coming to events and things, so we're not losing her altogether. So I shall finish with thanks to her, and I shall cringe, but I'm sure you all agree how deserved they are.
Yes.
Right, if you've all got the minutes of the last meeting, which have come to you through email, could we have a quick look at them and see whether there are any issues arising from them? On the first page, we've got a mention about Michael Pennington becoming a patron, and I presume that went ahead. I haven't heard any more about the clerks at Market Bosworth. I must remind myself just to write to my contact there and ask what's happened. Those of you who may not have heard about that, there was going to be a display in 2018 in Market Bosworth to commemorate the war in general, but including a visit by Sassoon with Bobby the Beautiful, who lived locally. And we sent some pictures and some notes. So we're rather hoping that we might hear from them someday. Falling attendances at events. Well, of course, we don't know what will happen when we can have events again. Whether we've all got so used to staying at home that we won't want to move. I hope we can have something at least. Sassoon's ancestors would have said next year in Jerusalem. I'd like to think next year in Matfield or London or Oxford or Cambridge or anywhere else that comes to mind. Obviously, the conference that we would have had in 2020 never took place. And one of the things we can start thinking about really is what we will do in terms of next year's events, whether virtual or actual. We had some suggestions, Cambridge, Formby. Nowhere's perfect, everywhere's possible. We supported the field of remembrance and collaboration with the Gallipoli Association. I believe that after that meeting, some of you went down to T. Lawrence's house in Folstead Road. This was after our meeting at St. Anne's. Doesn't this seem a long time ago? And there were suggestions about doing joint events, perhaps with the Thomas Hardy Association. I'd rather gallop through that. Have I missed out anything anyone would like to comment on? Don't all shout at once. Okay, can I take these minutes as a true record then?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks. Proposed by Viv, who seconded? I heard a male voice. All right, Kate.
Okay, yes, or
Too
whatever.
late to chat, whoever you were. Right. Matters arising from the minutes. Well, that's covered that. Secretary's report, Deb. I'm sorry, we have to ask you to speak again.
That's okay. If my sound goes funny in the middle of this, it'll be because my computer can't take having more than one screen open at a time, but I hope it's not going to play up. Bear with me a moment while I find my report. Okay. I hope everybody can hear me okay. 20 years ago, the Secret Sassoon Fellowship was founded at a small meeting in Malvern, following a talk by John Stewart Roberts. I believe there were 13 of us present, and John kindly reminded us that the Christian church was founded by 13 people. We can't claim to have expanded like the church has done, but we did make a lot of progress in the early years. But now the fallow years have arrived. We lost our president, Dennis Silk, about 2 years ago, and shortly after that along came COVID, resulting in the cancellation of many events and meetings, a dreadful time from which we're only just recovering. Even before Dennis passed away, I had realized that I would not be able to go on as secretary forever, and that it wasn't desirable for me to try. So I gave notice that I would not remain in the position beyond 2021, and the time has come for me to relinquish the responsibility. I would not have been doing the SSF any favors by staying. Every organization needs turnover, and any society that doesn't renew its membership will not survive. Last year, after taking advice from the Charities Commission, we did not hold an AGM. So this year we have some catching up to do. There is very little to be said about events this year because we've only had one in-person event, the annual cricket match at Matfield. Although the weather prevented the teams from holding a full-length match, the usual readings took place, and the informal 20-over match that took place was won by Shearston's 11. Despite the lack of live events, we've added to our online content on the Secret Sassoon Fellowship YouTube channel. When you search YouTube, you'll find it under the Secret Sassoon Fellowship. There we have a few recordings, including one of myself in conversation with our patron Neil Brand, an interview with Jean Moorcroft Wilson by our publicity officer Kate Giles, and a recording of the live online meeting that took place on 14th of June, at which Max Egremont and Vivian Welpton were interviewed by Phil Carradine. If you haven't seen this yet, do watch it, if only for Max's hilarious stories about his meeting with Stephen Tennant. While on that subject, you'll be aware of the new film Benediction that is officially released next month. From what I've seen and heard so far, it does appear to have taken considerable liberties with the story of Siegfried's life. On the plus side, it features Siegfried's 2 great-grandchildren among the extras. It will undoubtedly attract further attention to Siegfried's life and work, and I can only hope that it will help us find new members and expand our activities. A forthcoming event that may be of interest to members is the Alliance of Literary Societies annual conference, which was to have been a live event, including a tour of the Highgate area of London, but has unfortunately had to be changed to an online event. It will focus on the poets Gerard Manley Hopkins and John Betjeman, not, as the secretary of the Barbara Pym Society said last Saturday, Anthony Hopkins and John Betjeman. And it takes place on Saturday, the 2nd of October. For more information, take a look at the ALS website or contact me and I can find you a booking form to download. I'll end in the usual way by thanking my colleagues on the committee for their efforts during the year and hoping we can anticipate better things for 2022. That's the end of my report. If there are any questions, I'll attempt to answer them.
Have we heard at all recently, Deb, from Diana Silk?
No, but she has put a collection of Dennis's papers up for auction, but I don't know whether she's put them all up for auction or whether she's kept any back or whether, whether Cambridge University have bought any.
Just in case anybody missed that, Diana is now our president. in succession to Dennis, but we haven't seen or heard from her recently.
Yeah, I mean, I hear from her every so often, but she hasn't. I had hoped she might sign on today, but maybe the technology is a bit much for her.
Sorry, go on.
Hi, Kevin.
Just to say, the auction of quite a lot of Dennis's letters and books will be the 23rd of September. It's Lawrence's at Crewkerne in Somerset. That's Lawrences. Lawrence's of Crewkerne. There's a batch, I think, of 85 letters from Siegfried to Dennis with a suggested 8,000 to 10,000 and a number of books signed by Siegfried.
I think that it's possible to put in bids online now.
Yes.
But 23rd is presumably the closing date for that.
Yep.
But thanks for reminding me about that, Kevin.
Sorry, can you see me or hear me? I'm on the phone actually here. It's Austin.
Austin.
Yeah, you can actually put on a lot of online auctions. You can actually sort of like bid as the auctions go through. So there's not a purely like closing date before they start. You can actually be standing there on the phone or computer, pressing the button as they go through the under the hammer type of thing. But I don't know about this individual sort of auction, and I'd have to check my calendar. But I'm in Exeter, so conceivably I could actually go physically if there was a real need for it to do. But I suspect it's probably out of our sort of price range.
I fear so.
If we all do as well, attending it online as we're doing with this, probably none of us will get anything.
Well, if it goes to a collection in Cambridge or whatever, we'll be able, presumably, at some point to see it then.
I think Cambridge University Library are on the case, but like all of us, they have doubts about the price range and so on. Although they've got rather more money than any of us have.
Indeed so. Well, please all keep your eyes peeled for any news about that and let us know so we can get it on the website or on Facebook or whatever. Right, Deb, have you got anything to add?
Sorry, after I mute myself, or you'll hear my keyboard. Mute myself, or you'll hear my keyboard tapping as well as me sneezing and coughing. No, I haven't got anything else.
So we move on to a double act, Marcello, Treasurer's Report and the Journal. And Marcello, thank you very much for hosting this meeting.
Yeah.
Thanks, Meg. No problem at all. I'm going to see if I can share my screen to show you the Treasurer's Report. He says, forgetting how to do it now. I don't actually use Zoom at work, so I never hardly ever use this. I can't remember how to share the screen now. Can anybody remember off the top of their head?
If you put your cursor down at the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a green box saying share screen.
Oh, yeah, sorry, yeah. Here we go. Can you see that?
It's a bit small, but yes.
So this wouldn't have been presented this time last year, of course, but I've got the full numbers for 2020 and then an interim report for this year up to the 10th of September. 2020 is on the right hand side. What you'll see if you look down the bottom, compare the top to the bottom amounts, 414653 to 344314, is that we lost some money over the year. That's largely, of course, as a result of not getting any income from events. There's also the ongoing issue of membership subscriptions being lower than the cost of the journal. So 1,700 against 1,433. And that's repeated really in the 2021 numbers, where we've got another loss over the year, this time a bit lower, but that's because there was less expenditure. The journal cost less to produce, largely because I think Deb had cut out some members who hadn't paid subs, and also which saved in the summer. But you're still, the journal really isn't being paid for by membership subs. Now, I suspect in the past that was offset by income from events, but we're still in a situation where we've got more going out than coming in. The thing to say about the OA subscriptions, you'll recollect that we changed the agreement with the Wilford Owen Association so that any joint subscriptions to WA and SSF went through them, and they would work out a sum to give back to us, and that seemed a lot easier than the calculations that we were trying to do previously. So the 38950 in this year's column actually relates to 2020 members, so we were kind of a year behind with that. So we are due some money in from the WOA. I suspect that will come at the end of this year or the beginning of next for 2021. So we'll go into next year's numbers. But at the moment, as we stand, we have in two accounts. In the current account, got £58.74, and in the deposit account, which accrues a little bit of interest, minute piece of bit of interest every year, 20 pence, I think, last year. We've got just over £3,000. So that's where we stand. Are there any questions or comments on that?
Yes, Marcello. The WOA is pretty clear that it will be putting up its subscription, not this coming year, but the following year. I suggest that we could do the same at that point, because the shared membership. Sorry?
I think someone's got their microphone on, Meg. Sorry. There's...
So the shared arrangement obviously can only work if we have the same subscription. So I would suggest that we think of putting it up. It's been £10 since I don't know when. So it could reasonably go up somewhat. That's a matter for discussion.
So once again, the WOA are thinking of putting it up without actually telling us that they're thinking of it.
No, I'm telling you now, and it would be a long time before it happened. And it certainly wouldn't happen without consultation. This was just something we talked about at the most recent committee meeting.
I think if we think about the kinds of subscriptions we have, there are, and we have discussed this before at a committee level, there are a number of very odd payments going in, for some for quite small amounts, others for much larger amounts. So I think an overview of subscriptions generally would be a good thing.
Yes.
As would a, and I'll say a bit more about this in the journal, but a recalculation of actually how the journal can be sustainable and more aligned to the income, guaranteed income we're getting in. Because clearly, if this goes on for a number of years, then we're losing more and more money each time.
Well, the WOA journal, alas, is going to have to go online, except for people who don't have access to a computer. So far, the SSF has resisted that, but it'll be something to think about at intervals, won't it? There's something else I was going to say. Oh, yes, I know what it was. Possibly reducing the number of concessionary rates, keeping it as something simple, rather than having five or six different concessions. I don't know what people think about that. We don't have to decide today, it's just an idea.
Well, how do you mean, Meg? I don't think we've got any different concessions.
We've got couple concessions and...
No, we haven't got that anymore. We did away with that when we...
Right, oh, sorry, my fault. Right, well, in that case, that was a redundant comment on my part.
We haven't got that on paper, but we have got people paying different rates. And I suspect this is a very, a long historical thing. So I think not all members are currently on the the most up-to-date rates. When I look at the bank accounts and look at what's coming in from individual members, there's a huge discrepancy sometimes in what people are paying.
Marcello, may I come in a moment?
Yes, Sam.
When I
Hi,
was
Sam.
treasurer and took over, some people were sending in £2 standing orders and some people £4, dating back to the 1980s. And
Sam, that would have
took
been,
a
that would have
long
been
time
there in
to sort of
association.
gradually raise everyone to a sort of standard £10. And even so, there were many people who weren't thinking they were still members. Some of the people were almost dead, still sent in subscriptions. So you may get sort of redundant members still contributing unknown to them.
I think that's right, Sam. And I also think, I suspect we've also got people who are still paying the joint membership through us by the looks of it.
Yes.
Right.
Right.
So that's going to need a little bit of unpicking as well.
Yeah, you're quite right, Marcello. And it's not that they haven't been told, but people just forget to do it. And unfortunately, it's most common among the people who pay by standing order, who are the ones who are reliably paying every year. But because they don't think about it from year to year, they fall behind. There shouldn't be anybody who is ever paying £2 or £4. Those were old Wilfred Owen Association rates, and we've only ever had joint members, so we haven't got anybody paying that kind of rate.
Yes, the Owen Association, of course, is much older, so it does have things going back to the 80s. We at least only have 20 years of backlog. Anything else to comment on these figures of Marcello's?
No.
Is there anything else you want to say in your capacity as treasurer, Marcello, before we go on to your capacity as journal editor?
I don't think so, Meg. No, just that I think, from the discussions in the last few minutes, I think we're aware we need to just have a rethink about subscriptions and certainly modes of payment as well. It just needs a bit of a tidy up, I think. Okay, the journal. As I mentioned a few moments ago, we saved a bit of money on the journal, mainly I think Deb had very carefully gone through and made sure that we weren't sending out excess copies in the winter and summer issues. And I also took over from Mary, who'd done some formatting as well. So we've saved a bit of money on that. So I hope you're pleased with the first journal I produced. It took me longer than I thought it would, actually. So I was very pleased to see it come out, and certainly very pleased to have had the opportunity to interview Terence Davies. It was a wonderful occasion back with him in March, where he gave me almost half a day of his time, actually, and we had a great conversation. He brings, of course, as with Deb has said, I've read some early reviews and so forth, and seen snippets of the film. I think it's very clear that he'll bring his very idiosyncratic stamp and way of making films onto Benediction. If you've seen the Emily Dickinson biopic, of course, you'll know the kind of style that he has. But I think it will be great, and I agree with Deb. It would be great if we could get some new interest in Sassoon from that film. So I'm looking forward to seeing that when it comes out. So I hope you enjoyed that interview, and thanks also to Jane Potter and to Irene McCready, who wrote feature pieces as well. Very much enjoyed reading them. We have Irene's second part of on Philip Sassoon and Trent Park coming up in the next issue. So a couple of sort of more regular things that were brought into the last issue. The first was Kate Giles's media report. We now, of course, have various platforms on which we're disseminating information and providing events for members, such as Facebook, the YouTube channel, and so on, as well as the Twitter account that Kate has set up. So Kate has very kindly agreed to write a media report to keep members up to date on all those social media events. That will be a regular feature. And the second book ended the last edition. That was the Reading Siegfried part of the back, where a member. In this case, we had Heinfried Voss gave a personal reading, a personal response to one of Sassoon's poems, and we've got agreement from the estate of George Sassoon that we can also reprint the poem or the short prose extract that the member is looking at. So I'm on the lookout for people who are willing to produce for that. It doesn't need to be an academic reading. It can be a personal response. It can be any kind of response to a piece of Sassoon's writing. Heinfried, we were delighted that he was able to provide a German translation of Repression of War Experience. He has got some more, but I'm keen not to have just him in the first few issues. So anybody else who's interested, that would be great to hear from you. Lucy London has actually given me a piece already for the second iteration of that, so that will be good. Also, of course, I'm very interested to hear from members anything else that you think should go in the journal. It is, of course, paid by members, so any ideas, please do get in contact with me, whether that's an idea for an article or anything more regular that you think should be there. My email address is at the back of the journal, and as I think we've sort of touched on really this afternoon, and we've banded this idea a little bit around at the committee as well. It may well be a very good way forward to think about different levels of membership that have different access to the journal. So a membership plus a print journal option, and a membership plus a PDF journal option. I actually think it would be quite sad if we went completely electronic. So I would like to argue as much as I can for the maintenance of some print version of Siegfried's journal for as long as we can do. And a good way forward may well be to have different membership options that allow members to choose whether they just want a PDF version or whether they want the print version, and they get the PDF version, of course, as well, if they take that up. So I think that's a further conversation to be had and to be aligned with the conversations about how we address some of the issues around membership subscriptions as well.
Kate, I seem to remember you could think of some examples of other journals where there was both an online version and a print version. Am I right about that?
Yes, I mean, I do some work with the U3A, which is, you might be familiar with it, it's the University of the Third Age for retirees in the main, and they have a monthly newsletter in Essential, and there's a more detailed one twice a year. And that is produced, your membership is cheaper if you have the electronic version sent to you by email, or membership is dearer if you opt for paper versions by post.
I think that's quite common, and I think that's certainly something we should look into.
We can talk about that at our next committee meeting, can't we? Kate, could you possibly find us some facts and figures about specific journals before then?
What? Sorry, Meg.
Sorry, could you find some specific facts and figures about the kind of subscriptions that are charged?
Yeah, I can do. Yes, yeah.
And I've had some details from the Women's History Journal about how they do it. So it'd be interesting to compare and see what version might suit us.
I think the crucial thing in a time of uncertainty as regards to events is that we make sure that whatever subscriptions come in for a print version of the journal that pays for the print version of the journal effectively, or as much as possible, because of course a PDF version costs nothing to produce apart from time, which we're not paying for. So yeah, that's the crucial thing. So it needs just a re-evaluation of the numbers really around this.
And that doesn't stop people printing it off at home, does it? If they
no, not at all.
They want to read a paper copy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And actually might be quite attractive if for people who read on their iPads or screens and so on. I mean, if you had the print version, we'd give members the PDF version as well. Clearly, I mean, it wouldn't be silly not to. But yeah, I think that's it. So, if there are any questions on any of that or comments, please ask.
How
Thank
do
you very
you
much.
arrange the security for those who have paid for the version to download it and those that haven't? I mean, because people can't sort of hack into it and just download it without paying, or
No, I mean, there are various ways of sharing it. You know, it could be shared via PDF. We could have it on the website with a password. I mean, there are various ways of doing it to make sure that not everybody could get it.
okay, fine.
I mean, if people then share it with others, there's not much we can do about that. You know, it's like any PDF. You can
Just
forward
like
it to
paper one,
anybody.
you can
Yeah,
share.
just like the paper one, you can give it to your friends to copy. Yeah.
Well, then, I think many thanks to Marcello for doing his two jobs so efficiently and making it so clear and easy for us. Sorry, forgot I was muted. Before we move on to the election of the committee and officials, have we got any motions? No proposals of any kind?
Well, yes, Meg, I haven't a
Haven't
motion, but I would quite like to ask Kate about cooperation between the Twitter fields, because I'm at the moment running the War Poets Association Twitter, and she's running the Sassoon Twitter, and it'd be quite, since people interested in one might well be interested in the other, a sort of perhaps occasional link saying, look at this, look at that, and maybe with the Wilfred Owen Association page as well, though that seems to be rather inactive. I don't know what you think about that.
I mean, we can do, but it's a way of coordinating it, isn't it? And
Yeah.
I'm afraid it's quite a haphazard with me as to what I put on there. I try and keep it in line with Sassoon's diary dates or any letters that have been written on specific days, and it's more of a case of on this day, such and such happened.
That's right, I see that.
And I've tried to avoid a lot of the First World War stuff, purely because the War Poets Association are very much covering those war years, and because of the film and so on, I've tried to sort of get some more interest into his post-war life.
Yes, I see that. Yes, you're quoting from his diaries.
Yes, in the main.
Day, exactly.
Yeah, not the digital ones so much, because I thought, well, I'll need some material for next year, so I've left those for now. Just the printed versions at the minute.
Well, I am doing sort of a variety of very unknown poets who've only published one or two poems, you know, sort of letters home, not recognised war poets, which is sort of something that's fairly rare, hasn't been done much before. Yes, that's a sort of, it's the War Poets Association. It's meant to be all war poetry, but I only know anything about World War One. It's very restricted to that at the moment.
We share a lot of that stuff on Facebook, Sam.
Sorry, you do?
We share a lot of it, and Patrick Vill is a regular contributor to the Facebook page.
All right.
And you've got a Facebook account as well, so you're welcome to help with the effort.
I should perhaps use Facebook as well, but I'm only using Twitter at the moment. I haven't sort of come to terms with Facebook, but I think that has a wider following, doesn't it?
It depends what you mean by following, really.
Well, more followers.
Yeah, but you don't have followers on Facebook. We've got over 500 people who are members of the SSF Facebook group, but they're not all members of the association. Oh. But can you tell out of your Twitter followers which ones are regular followers and which ones are just occasional followers?
I don't know whether one can or not. I don't.
No, exactly.
I don't worry about the numbers. I just put it up, and who wants it can find it. We normally have about 200 or 300 followers a day, I think, sort of drop in. So according to the number at the top left corner of the screen.
Sorry, I'm being very incompetent here. I know there are still quite a lot of us, I'm afraid, who don't think in terms of social media. Well, perhaps we should all really try. This is a good use of it as opposed to all the very unpleasant uses of it that abound. Right, do we have anything else arising from the discussion about the journal and about other methods of communication? Do we have any other possible proposals or motions? Nothing's been submitted, but
Now, I'd just like to thank Marcello for all the work he's doing,
Yes.
both online and with the journal. And it's very nice to have sort of his input, re-energizing the association.
yes.
Thank you, Sam. That's very kind of you to say that. Thank you.
Shall we move on then to the election of the committee? Can I draw your attention to the, first of all, to the sentence underneath the list of proposed members? At the moment, Deb, of course, has been doing membership secretary, minutes secretary, and events secretary. We didn't call it that, but she did all those things. Irene has very kindly undertaken to do the minutes from now on. Michael Wilson, who I don't think is with us here, sadly, but has agreed to do the membership. We still need somebody to organise events. We don't have to decide that today. We've got a forthcoming event with Sister Jessica Gatti, Sassoon's niece. I can't give you details of the timing yet, but the date is the 26th of October, and we will obviously circulate you. There will be presumably other events fairly shortly after that, and probably for the time being, we can decide them and work them out as a committee. But at some point, it would help if we had an individual who could take on the organisation of finding a place, organising the catering, organising the speaker. I'm not asking for volunteers now, but if you think you might be interested, please let me know by email. Or if you think you know somebody who might be interested, please invite them to get in touch with me, plus any other ideas anybody may have. But for the moment, we've got a slate which remains pretty well unchanged. Chair, Meg Crane, myself. Vice Chair, Chris, and I've twisted his arm because I love having him as Vice Chair. Marcello, who does so many things, Publications Officer and Treasurer. Irene, as I've mentioned, has taken over as Minutes Secretary. Michael Wilson as Membership Secretary. Kate very kindly agreed to go on being Publicity Officer. The ordinary committee members are Sam, Cynthia, Austin, Tim, and Anne. Can I ask somebody to propose that whole slate, unless there's some objection to doing so?
Okay, proposed.
Right, thank you. Seconded? Good, thank you. I hope the silence doesn't mean that people aren't happy with it.
Tim can't propose everybody because he's on the list.
Okay, sorry, no, I didn't know what the.
Well done, Deb, sorry.
Propose Tim.
Okay, scrub that then.
I'll do it. Derek will do it.
Thank you, Derek. I trust nobody has any objection to any of that. Right. Please bear in mind that if you do something about it. Okay, so we'll be recruiting, thinking about, contemplating events secretary, but at the moment, our only immediately forthcoming event will be online, and it's already organised. Right, so now does it seem too ridiculously rash to ask about next year's conference? Whether anybody's got any ideas? This would be talking about a year from now. Obviously, we don't know whether we'll be free to have a non-virtual meeting by then, but there must be at least some chance. Does anybody have particular ideas about topics or places?
Hello, Meg. I was originally against the sort of idea of tying us into Oxford, but especially as we don't know what's happening next year, if we were to have a physical meeting, would it make sense just to do the same as we did the last fiscal meeting, is it all seemed to work out extremely well.
Which was in Oxford.
Yeah, I mean, I was initially against, but I mean, being as I don't see any reason why we don't sort of keep Oxford for the foreseeable future. If you know, it's reasonably easy to get to from wherever, and we don't have to go through this rigmarole every year of sort of yes, but maybe type of thing.
Well, I'm told it's very difficult to get to Oxford from Cambridge.
All right.
Which of course is where some of them live.
Well, they manage it for the boat race, don't they? So
That's not in either Oxford or Cambridge.
No.
I think Oxford is a good bet, because it's I don't know, whenever we've held it there, it's always been successful, and Oxford is an interesting place in itself. But at the same time as that, I don't know whether I'd favour the idea of having it there each year. I think the pleasure of moving around to different places connected with Sassoon is really, really quite interesting myself.
Yes.
I would agree with that, Cynthia. I think, you know, to go to Marlborough College was you know,
Yeah,
I wouldn't get an
good.
opportunity to do that, for example. So I thought that was pretty good. And there are obviously other locations that are linked with Sassoon, but I appreciate they're not always the easiest of places to get to, certainly at AGM level. But yeah, I would agree with you on that.
Liverpool
Western,
seems
but
suggested.
and yeah, Marlborough, and also where he lived. That we've had one there once, didn't we? In his old house, Western Burt, was it called?
Really?
Wearley, that's right. No, not Wearley. The one down in Dorset.
Down in Wiltshire, Heytesbury.
Wiltshire, yeah, Wiltshire.
Heytesbury, yes.
Heytesbury, that's it. Yes, Heytesbury. That's a good.
And Liverpool was a suggested, wasn't it? Which would be nice for members in the north not to have to travel such a long way for once.
Do any?
Yes, I would appreciate Liverpool, and you know, it is a fascinating city.
I think we do, and both societies have members who don't get to events because they always tend to be in the southern half of the country.
I found it quite easy to get down to the major centres like Oxford. It's very easy there. It's just if it's something that's really off the beaten track, a small village or something like that, there can be a problem. But I have a car. I mean, people who don't have a car and are going by public transport would find it difficult either to go somewhere in the north or somewhere in the south, you know, sometimes, wouldn't they?
Yes, Marlborough had that drawback, didn't it, that there's no station.
Yeah.
Well, shall we just ask the minutes secretary to record that a number of suggestions have been made, and we'll work away at them before the next conference is arranged, and we'll eventually know more about whether we can have it in a physical location or not.
Well, it might also depend on the speaker that you invite as to their sort of interest and where they came from, and that sort
That's
of
true. Right. Any more thoughts about the conference? I'd be very interested, and I'm sure other members of the committee would be too, to hear suggestions for speakers and events. Anytime it occurs to any of you, please let me know. Have we got any other business?
Just to say, Meg, that as far as I know, I'll be sort of revisiting my idea of doing the year's events based around Hamo, starting from next year's remembrance, field of remembrance. But again, that obviously depends on circumstances beyond our control.
Are we talking about Uncle Hamer or Brother Hamer?
Brother,
Right.
the one who was killed at Gallipoli. So
Yes.
I'll basically tie in my what I do with the Gallipoli Association, starting again from next year, which
Good
I believe
idea.
it was fairly early in the year when the Field of Remembrance was opened. But I'll take my cue from them.
Right. Any other business?
I just thought that something occurred to me that I should have mentioned under matters arising. The plaque in, sorry,
Matthew.
I am
Brenchley.
unmuted. The plaque in Brenchley,
Yes.
which we were horrified to learn had been taken down. We don't really know when this happened, but apparently it was in a poor state, and it was only put up in 2018. We thought at the time that it wasn't a good idea putting it on the outside of the village hall, but they reassured us that it would withstand the weather. When we went down to Matfield for the cricket match, I talked to Peter Danby. He said they'd been very keen to have it on the cricket pavilion, but hadn't been allowed because I think it was the local, whatever they're called, not the community council, district council, I don't know, but the local council didn't want it there. And all I could do was say that we would be, in fact, I did write to, who did we write to, Meg? Did I just write to you saying that we wanted it?
And Margot got in touch with Kevin,
Yeah,
who's the one who's restoring it.
yeah,
Well, he thinks that it'll be all right outside if it has the right varnish on it.
okay.
And I must say my own feeling is that it's better where it is, together with those memorial gates at Brenchley,
Yes.
which some of us went to the dedication of.
There is,
Whereas Sassoon did do other things apart from playing cricket. It seems a pity in a way to have it there, but anyway, it doesn't seem to be possible. However, Kevin does seem to think he can make it weatherproof, but it's going to take until next spring before he feels it's safe to put it up.
okay. Thank you.
Meg, just on that, can I ask if you found out anything about what was going on at Wearley with the scaffolding?
No, I'm afraid I haven't heard a thing. Margot
Oh.
might know. You're muted, Margot.
Yeah, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
No, I don't know. I've taken a photo of it, which might be useful to go in the journal. I'll make inquiries and put an email out, but I don't know. The whole house is scaffolded, and possibly it might just be the roof that needs redoing. But I don't really know any more than that.
There was nothing about it in Roundabout, which is the parish mag.
No. And no planning
Thanks.
permission or anything like that I have seen.
Right, so it can't be anything terribly major then.
Well, I think probably it's just got old and bits of it need replacing, I
Yes.
should think. I'll see if I can find out.
It would be good if you could. Any other business? Well, my concluding remarks, of course, are beginning with thanks to you all for coming. And I hope all or almost all of you are going to be able to stay for the presentation afterwards. I don't want to make Deb squirm, but of course, huge gratitude to her for all these years. And don't become a stranger, Deb, please. And I'm afraid I may have to ask your advice from time to time in the coming year. I suggest that we have a 10-minute comfort break now, and then come back for our talks on a mixture of little-known and well-known Sassoon poems by Marcello, Paul, and me. Well, I think we might get started. This idea has been pinched rather shamelessly from Jane Popper's Wilfred Owen series. We thought we'd try shorter talks. Often I think Sassoon's poems aren't quite so densely textured as Owen's. We just thought we'll try this and see, and I'm so grateful to Marcello and Paul for agreeing to do it. Not only are they both extraordinarily good speakers, they're both brilliant with the computer, whereas I have specific and general learning difficulties. Anyway, we're going to start with Marcello, what to do. If you enjoy this, if you think it's a good idea, please volunteer yourself for future sessions. Right, Marcello, over to you. Tell us what you're going to do.
Thank you, Meg. I'm going to try with my camera kept on, but I did have to turn it off a few times during the last bit of the AGM because I've got an unstable connection, which is ironic given what you've just said. We'll see how we get on. if you'll freeze, I'll turn my camera off, and then that should solve any problems. Can you see the screen?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yes.
Bernie.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk about Farewell to a Room, which of course appears in The Heart's Journey, but I'm going to say a little bit about the collection first of all. It's actually, I think it was bizarrely, it was the first ever book of Sassoons I had for some reason. I don't know why. I've had it for a long, long time, certainly before collections of the war stuff. So I've always felt a kind of connection to it. And I wrote a chapter on it quite recently for a book I've done, and I came back to it, and I had a wonderful time going back through the poems there. And I think there's some really wonderful stuff. So I'm very happy to talk about it today. So I'm going to start by saying a little bit about the collection generally, and then provide a sort of, I suppose, close reading really of Farewell to the Room, albeit an idiosyncratic one, of course. So on the 1st of May 1922, actually, Sassoon writes in his diary that he had only manufactured 17 poems since 1919. And he called his output since September 20 sapless and over-ingenious. Of course, I've written and destroyed a lot of slushy stuff, he writes. But almost 18 months later, the slushy stuff seems to be more appealing, or at least appears so. And on the 5th of October 1923, he writes that he had decided to call my next book, Love and Lyrical Poems, The Heart's Journey, and publish it in October 1926, after my 40th birthday. On the 26th of October, Song Be My Soul, which Sassoon wrote as being quite pleasant, appears in his diary. The poem which ultimately opened The Heart's Journey addresses the speaker's desire to return to the childhood's garden, to bring back the summer dawns. And one of several themes in the collection, and also addressed by Sassoon in his prose trilogies, is this nostalgic learning for what he termed the old days at the garden at Wearley. And this is explicitly framed, and talk about this quite a bit, in a metaphor of a journey where the speaker sees himself as running backwards and forwards through time. In fact, it's framed in the phrase time's way-worn traveller in that poem, and captures the quest to return to a set of previously experienced events and identities. So The Heart's Journey, of course, was published in a limited edition in 1927, and then an ordinary edition with 7 additional poems in 1928. And it marks an explicit turning away from the satirical poems of the early and mid-20s. Jean Moorcroft-Wilson suggests it projects a poetic voice quite different from the angry tones of the war satires, although a review in the Times Literary Supplement argued that only a few poems were comparable in force, in intensity of feeling to the poems written during the war or immediately after it. Michael Thorpe, in his 1966 book, which I think still remains one of the best examples of close reading of Sassoon, even after 50 years, really frames everything that Sassoon wrote from The Heart's Journey onwards within this journey metaphor. And he argues it's a continual journey towards, I suppose, the conversion poems of the late 50s. And he reads the poems in The Heart's Journey as preparations for a journey, setting the house in order, checking its contents, deciding what will be needed and what can and must be left behind. So, as I say, I'm going to provide a reading of Farewell to a Room, which occurs in The Heart's Journey. And the poem is generally read as Sassoon's farewell poem to 54 Tufton Street in London, which housed the small flat where he lived from August 1920 to the end of November 1925. He had mixed feelings towards the time he spent there, according to Moorcroft-Wilson, who nonetheless reads the poem as nostalgic and indicative of a change of style his situation would, and a change of situation that would develop in a move away to a more meditative, inward-looking verse. So effectively, they're the same sentiment as expressed by Michael Thorpe. So here's the poem. It's fairly short. So, Farewell to a Room. Room, while I stand outside you in the gloom, your tranquil toned interior, void of me, seems part of my own self, which I can see. Light, while I stand outside you in the night, shutting the door on what has housed so much, nor hand, nor eye, nor intellect could touch. Cell, to whose firelit walls I say farewell. Could I condense 5 winters in one thought, then might I know my unknown self and tell what our confederate silences have wrought. So the poem begins with the speaker's address to the room, and then describes this situation where the speaker is standing outside in the gloom. It contains two phrases, outside you and in the gloom, where the speaker imagines himself as part of something else. In the first, the speaker has become detached from the room, while in the second, an inverse relationship exists, so that the speaker is now positioned within the gloom. These alternative conceptualizations are also thematically distinctive, I think. The voice is addressed in the second person you, hinting at familiarity and intimacy, with an emphasis on darkness and unknown, however, in the second. This distinction made between the room, conceived as an attractive space, and the speaker who now stands outside, is emphasized in the poem's second line, which repeats the initial alignments that the room, again addressed using second person, is portrayed in a much more granular manner, much more specific, and positioned at the start of the line for maximum attentional focus. And this effect, I think, is heightened by the sound patterning across the phrase tranquil toned interior. And this evokes straight away the movement of the self as part of this kind of broader metaphor of the journey. But it's also at this point, I think, the poem presents or poses a conundrum for the reader, which is integral to the poem in its entirety. The speaker emphasizes his distance from the room and yet highlights that the room is part of my own self. And I think this puzzle can be solved by thinking about how the poem draws on a very common strategy that we have more generally for decompressing our sense of identity into smaller discrete parts. And this is commonly known in linguistics as a divided person metaphor. So we can talk of ourselves as an experience in consciousness or subject, which can objectify different versions of ourself, split in time and space. So for example, in something like, sorry, I'm not myself today, I and myself refer to two different entities, one, the conceptualizing presence, and the second, the object of that thought. And we often get expressions that draw out these possible selves, which result in so-called split selves metaphors. So for example, I keep going backwards and forwards between my scientific self and my religious self, and so on. So that selves are often shown and presented as incompatible or inconsistent aspects of oneself. And so more broadly, split selves can include all cases of a character or an individual or a speaking voice being divided or duplicated in some way and across time and space, or any other way in which self can be conceived as fragmented. And this is what I think we get in Farewell to a Room, where we have different versions or selves of the speaker. The first is physically removed from the room, the second viewed as a kind of container in its own right, and within which a different yet connected version of the room is enclosed. And my own interpretation of the poem's first paragraph rests on this moment of revelation for the speaker, who, in removing himself from a physical space, is now able to reflect on that space's effect on him over time. And this emerging understanding of the self as a growing phenomenon is evident also in I Can See, which reconfigures this opposition of light and darkness of the first line and draws on another very common conceptualization, that of understanding is seeing. And this foregrounds the speaker's newly discovered insight. And for me, this appears to align very neatly with this overarching journey metaphor that Thorpe has claimed for the heart's journey more generally. The emphasis on sight also provides a cohesive link with the second verse paragraph, whose first line also repeats the structure of the opening of the poem. In this case, the two embedded phrases outside you and in the night are again dependent on an in-out patterning. In the first, the speaker stands outside of the light, while in the second, the inverse relationship positions the speaker in the night. Again, an echo of the first of in the gloom in the first verse paragraph. The sense of being within provides a structure for the rest of the poem. Firstly, insofar as the speaker emphasizes this remoteness outside and shutting a door. However, the poem also progressively emphasizes a move through shifting subjects, hand, eye, intellect, from a more physical to a more spiritual connection that the speaker has felt. The word cell, of course, appearing in the next line as the speaker sets off to end outside of the room through the reporting of the speech act, I say farewell, may be read as synonymous with room, but is presented with greater granularity again to present a more meditative, monk-like existence, or even one of incarceration. Indeed, of course, in his own account of his time at Tufton Street, Sassoon writes of the hermitage of my private self, which aligns with the interpretation again proposed by Thorpe. The ending of the poem brings together the overarching ideas into a single image that defines its message. The speaker sets up a hypothetical situation in which 5 years, winters, are brought together, compressed and integrated into one thought. Here, could triggers a remote situation, which builds up this imagined space, in turn developed into a much fuller mental representation of potential, in which the speaker knows my unknown self and tells what our confederate silences have wrought. For me, then, the poem's ending outlines the speaker's desire to bring together a fully defined version of the self, one that's aggregated from several selves rather than disaggregated, so that very over time are conceived as whole again, united in the use of the first person hour. And yet, the poem, wonderfully, also presents a set of apparent inversions and contradictions, evident in the contrast of the unknown becoming known, silences being told, presented here not as certainties but as possibilities. The distinction here is between what is known and what simply might only be possible, and this is really important. I began my discussion by quoting Jean Moorcroft Wilson's reading of the poem as an example of inward-looking meditation. My analysis demonstrates that the language of the poem repeatedly outlines both the split self, which has multiple iterations standing within and outside bounded spaces, and its various states of completeness and fragmentation, an overall identity which is conceptualized, shaped, and reshaped through time along an ongoing path. And the increasingly abstract nature of the poem, moving as it does from the speaker's physical detachment from the room to a more hypothetical and mentally, if not physically possible situation that ends the poem, thus represents a meditative stance, allowing the poem to be read as part of a grander set of physical and mental movements. Indeed, Sassoon seems to suggest this, returning once more to his diaries and poems in 1949 for what would become an incomplete and unpublished attempt to write a 7th book of autobiography. He writes, "It represented," the poem, "the part of me which I had always instinctively tried to keep separate. In that room, I should be a single-minded poet. Elsewhere, I should be the person who went about experiencing things and reacting in different ways to the various people he was with. Wherever I went, I should leave my private self behind in that room, in whose confederate silences through many a night time he had sought to discover and develop such talents as he were, and to understand and express the finer elements of being." So he's pretty much coming back to the poem itself and using various lines to frame that discussion of it. So this retrospective analysis seems to me to offer a very neat, if somewhat simplified, obviously, view of the poem, as it highlights various and explicit emerging concerns with identity that, of course, from the Heart's Journey onwards will be replicated across other collections of verse, as well as, of course, in the 2 prose trilogies. And it's not just that discussion of identity and concern with identity, but that identity is intrinsically and inherently concerned with, of course, the relationship between different selves split across conceptualizations of time and space. I think it's a wonderfully clever poem in both puzzling us, but also offering us some insight into how the poetic self can be conceived and discussed. And that's it. Hopefully you can still hear me. I haven't been talking to a screen for the last 10 minutes.
No, we did hear you, Marcello.
Oh,
Thank
good.
you very
Okay.
much. I suggest that we leave questions to the end, because I think these little talks are probably going to feed off each other to some extent. I hope that's all right with everyone. Many, many thanks, Marcello.
Thank you, Meg.
Thank you.
Follow on. I'm going to try to share the screen now. That doesn't work, does it?
Marcello has to allow you to share the screen.
Oh, right. Marcello, can you do
Yeah,
that?
let me do that. Sorry, I thought I had made you a co-host. If I make you the host, Meg,
Right.
That might
Well-
work, but you then may have to.
Or failing that, you've got a copy of
I
what
have,
you're
yeah.
going to share.
Do you want to try that?
Yes. Anything for an easier life.
Does that work?
Not yet.
Okay.
Meg, can you see the share screen box at the bottom?
Yes, and I pressed it several times.
What's it say?
Well, it's brought up a lot of little windows, nothing large enough to read.
So you'll need to click on it. You'll need to, it should then say share. You need to click on the one you want to share.
Okay,
It should
That's
come up.
it.
That's it.
thank you
You've got
very
it.
much. Oh, I've learned something. Thank heavens for that. I did mention this poem briefly a couple of years ago when we met at Oxford. I'm not really apologising for going back to it because I think more has emerged from it. And I'm interested in what Marcello has just been saying about the split self, because I think we see another aspect of that here. This was written in the first week of October 1918. The war wasn't, of course, quite over, but it was clearly going to be over. Bassoon had a frantically busy few days in London while on leave from the convalescent home in Lennell in Northumberland. The time at Lennell was actually quite fruitful for poems of a surprising range, including the poem Falling Asleep, which is much more hopeful in tone than many of Sassoon's poems of that period. He seems to be coming to terms with his experiences. Anyway, on this visit to London, he and various other people visited the Ballet Russe, which was showing a revival of the Ballet Cleopatra, which was about 10 years old. It had been choreographed by Michel Fokine and included more music by Mussorgsky and Glinka and Rimsky-Korsakov. And what I only discovered fairly recently, it's not the Antony and Cleopatra story, which I'd always assumed. It's an invented story about a young couple, and the young man, part of the couple, falls hopelessly in love with Queen Cleopatra, who agrees to spend the night with him on condition that he drinks poison at the end of the night. So it's not the story you expect. Leonid Massine was the principal male dancer and choreographer of the Ballet Russe by that time. He'd replaced Nijinsky. O beauty doomed and perfect for an hour, leaping along the verge of death and night, you show me dauntless youth that went to fight 4 long years past, remembering, discovering pride and power. You die, but in our dreams, we watch you fall, knowing that tomorrow you will dance again, but not to ebbing music for they slain, who sleep in ruined graves beyond recall, who, following phantom glory, friend and foe, into the darkness that was war must go, blind, banished from desire. O mortal heart, be still. You have drained the cup, you have played your part. Sometimes it's set out as a 3-stanza piece with a break between recall and who. I simply followed the version that came to hand, but it would make sense to divide it up into 3 stanzas like that, which I think I may go ahead and do. It's unusual for Sassoon actually to use the second person pronoun you, which is ironic when you think that we've just heard a poem in which he does that, addressing a room as you. Normally, the pronouns that Sassoon favors are I, me, he, him, they, them. Almost never we or us. I say almost, there are a few exceptions. And not very commonly you. And when he says you, sometimes he's addressing himself, and sometimes he's addressing someone or something outside himself, and sometimes he slides between the two. And I think that happens here. The first line is a sort of classic statement of romanticism. Beauty doomed and perfect for an hour. Beauty is indissolubly linked with death for the romantics. Keats says she dwells with beauty, beauty that must die. And Sassoon echoes Keats in O beauty born of lovely things that die, in another poem from this collection to show. doomed and perfect for an hour. So something that has a very fixed ending, leaping along the verge of death and night. Liminality for Sassoon is quite important. And again, we saw that in the room poem, being on the threshold, having just crossed the threshold, moving back from the threshold, the verge of death and night. The dazzling dancer is between that light and dark, life and death. But the speaker isn't following the plot of the ballet very closely. He's making his own associations. You show me dauntless youth that went to fight 4 long years past, discovering pride and power. He can't help segueing into his thoughts about the war that is virtually over and the recognition of all that's gone, all that's lost. Dauntless youth, and of course Sassoon is very romantic about the male body. Discovering pride and power, the excitement of war, the excitement of fighting, which of course he experienced himself. You die, but in our dreams. Now here, obviously, he's addressing Massine and the part Massine plays, the youth, Arun, I think it was called. You die, but in our dreams, who watch you fall, knowing that tomorrow you will dance again. There's the illusion, but at the same time, the knowledge that it's an illusion. One part of the brain registers the fact that this is a dancer performing, and at the end, when the curtain's dropped, he'll pick himself up off the floor and go home. But not to ebbing music were they slain, who sleep in ruined graves beyond recall. Ebbing music. Shortly, I'm going to have a quick look at the poem Aftermath. And he talks about the thoughts that flow. So in 2 poems written only about 4 months apart, we've got ebbing music, music pulling away, receding, and thoughts that flow, something moving in to fill the gap. Slain, of course, is a romantic word. Who sleep in ruined graves beyond recall. A lot of alliteration in this poem, quite unobtrusive, not crude, but ruined, recall, slain, sleep, die, dreams, dance. Ruined graves reminds us, of course, that the tidy graveyards we now know were a thing of the future then. What we had then was the waste of mud, the broken wooden crosses, the memorials that had disappeared as soon as they were put up. Beyond recall, the dead were dead, as Vera Brittain said, and would never be coming back. Who, and this is still in opposition to they, the dead, who, following phantom glory, friend and foe. Phantoms, ghosts appear a lot in this collection picture show. We know Sassoon had read Walter Delamere at the time. And I think some of the spookiness and the eeriness of Delamere finds its way into these poems. Into the darkness that was war must go, and friend and foe can be in opposition to phantom glory, or they. They, our friends and our foes, ourselves and our enemies, followed phantom glory. But phantom glory itself was both a friend and an enemy, a temptation and a killer. Into the darkness that was war must go. Compulsion, like the hero of the ballet, an insane sacrifice. One night of passion to be followed by death by poison. And the cruel irony, the dead of the war, is that they are banished from desire, that love and longing are no longer part of what's possible for them. Blind, we also find again in Aftermath, the anger, the blind compassion that seized and shook through them. And banished is another key Sassoon word. You'll remember the poem that begins, I am banished from the patient man who died. Excluded, sent away, punished. In Marcello's interview with Terence Davis, I noticed Terence Davis remarked that Sassoon was constantly trying to be saved, looking for salvation. and always choosing the wrong person to save him. In another interview that Terence Davies has given recently, he talked about Sassoon wishing to be worthy. I think what this is coming out in this last line and a half. Oh, mortal heart. Now, who is he talking to? Is he talking to Nassim? Is he talking to the young man in the play? Is he talking to himself? I think at least partly he's talking to himself, as he does in Aftermath, as we may have time to see. Be still, you have drained the cup. Now, Sassoon wasn't above recycling lines that hadn't worked the first time. He'd used a version of this in an earlier poem called Testament, which is in the diaries, though not in the collections. There he says, oh, my heart, be still, you have drained the cup, you have played your part. Now it's, oh, mortal heart, the stress is on death. You have drained the cup. Well, originally this must have been a reference to Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. My Father, let this cup pass from me. But of course now we've also got the cup of poison that the young hero of Cleopatra drinks. You have drained the cup, so you've done what you were told to do. You've assured your own death. You have played your part. You've done what you could. So it's a very mixed message, isn't it? It's a resolve to go on living, the last line. You've done enough, you've done all you could, with the implication that now there should be room for something else. But also the sense that what's happened can't be retrieved and is vanishing into the darkness, and that's painful, that's a loss. We find that a great deal, for instance, in London as well, where he grieves the fact that the war goes further and further away into the past, and that he still feels part of it, but it's receding from him. I'm going to try and scroll down now to Aftermath, which you'll find much more familiar, of course, a much better known poem. There's a difference in tone, and it's partly because of the metre. This is a very adventurous metre, something that Sassoon doesn't do elsewhere. In the Cleopatra poem, we've got fairly standard iambic pentameters. Two of the stanzas rhyme in the in memoriam meter, A, B, B, A, hour, night, fight, hour, fall, again, slain, recall. And then at the volta, or turning point, it moves over to rhyming couplets, bow and go, heart and part, a change of tone, something a bit less elegiac, a bit more fired with resolution of one kind or another. Aftermath is very weird in terms of scansion. When I was teaching, I used to try it out on my pupils, because even native speakers often have difficulty scanning a line of poetry. Although they'd read it perfectly, if you ask them where the stresses came, they'd put them in the oddest places. If we look just at a sample of a few lines, have you forgotten yet? 3 stresses. For the world's events have rumbled on since those gag days. 6 or 7 stresses, like traffic checked while at the crossing of city way. 6. And the haunted gap in your mind has filled with thoughts that flow. 6. Like clouds in the lit heaven of life, you're a man reproved to go. 7. So shades of Jeremiah Hopkins in a way. It won't do just to count the stresses, you have to count the syllables as well. And it gives the impression, to my mind, of somebody coming to terms with things, and somebody whose emotions and convictions are very mixed, the split self again, if you like. He looks forward to the future. As he says in Siegfried's Journey, he was insolent with health and summer weather, apparently having recovered much more than he really had. But the past is just the same, and war's a bloody thing, a broken line, like a sob. And we have to remember that bloody is a double meaning as well, obviously sanguinary, but also, as in the Pygmalion, a shocking word for the period. Sassoon was the man who first used the word syphilitic in a poem. Have you forgotten yet? Look down and swear by the slain of the war, which you'll never forget. And in the days when he was making his protest, according to Graves, he looked down at the pavement and seemed to see the faces of the dead on the pavement writhing around him. But also you look down in shame. So there's a sense of guilt, which is why I called this brief essay, Can I Forgive Myself? He's trying to forgive himself in the Leonid Nassim poem. And here he's setting out the conditions for forgiving himself. And here we come into the use of you as the pronoun where he addresses himself. Because the dark months at Manette are undoubtedly Sassoon's own experience. My own very first introduction to him was at the age of about 12, when I heard him reading on the radio. I think it was a program about the year 1919. And I remember the sonorous roll of these lines. Do you remember? Do you remember? Do you ever? It's a kind of litany. And the last stanza, and I'm conscious of time running out, do you remember that hour of din before the attack and the anger, the blind compassion? Like blind, banished from desire. A blind man has lost the ability to choose, to discriminate, to pick his way. As you peered at the doomed and haggard faces of your men, doomed again, oh beauty doomed and perfect for an hour. Do you remember those ashen grey masks? Have you forgotten yet? Look up and swear by the green of the spring that you'll never forget. Up, swear, green, spring, never get. 6 stanzas again, 6 stretches, sorry, again. Have you forgotten yet? It's a challenge. It invites the answer no. But here he's addressing himself. Look up. There is hope. You have got a life to live, but there's a price to pay, and you've got to promise to pay it. So we've got 2 ways of coming to terms with things, neither of them perfect, neither of them complete, of course, because it was something which he only possibly came to terms with after his religious conversion, perhaps not even then. So we've got this pronoun you, which is so ambiguous and slippery. Sassoon often presents himself, as in the poem that Marcello uses, an outsider, on the verge, liminality. And here we've got him again on the threshold between one season and the next. Thank you very much. And can we move on, please, to Paul?
Thank you, Meg. Can you shut down your share screen?
Just trying to, yes. Oh dear, sorry, it's not working. How can I get rid of it? Right, I think that's it.
Okay. Help if I shared the right document. Let's try again. That's it. There we go. It's fortuitous, perhaps, that without any coordination between us, Marcello and Meg and I are working our way backwards. So I'm going back to the war poems. There are several of them. This is one in which Sassoon lets rip against people's failure to recognize or understand the realities of the soldier's experience. Does it matter losing your legs? For people will always be kind, and you needn't show that you mind when others come in after hunting to gobble their muffins and eggs. Does it matter losing your sight? There's such splendid work for the blind, and people will always be kind as you sit on the terrace, remembering and turning your face to the light. Do they matter, those dreams from the pit? You can drink and forget and be glad, and people won't say that you're mad, for they know that you fought for your country, and no one will worry a bit. Well, comment is almost superfluous, but one thing that strikes me about this and one or two other poems like it is that in spite of all that exasperation and fury on Sassoon's part, he still perhaps is able to allow the possibility, just the possibility of a kind of dreadful innocence, you might say, in these people's behavior, a kind of benefit of the doubt. They may not be totally hypocritical. They're just invincibly blinkered and ignorant. Well, perhaps. By contrast, though, and this is what I want to come on to this afternoon, there is a set of individuals who apparently, for Sassoon, deserve no such benefit of the doubt. This one I'm sure you will know. They. I'll make it slightly bigger. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys reply. For George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim's shot through the lungs and like to die. And Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who's served that hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. Well, that final line, it has something of the same deadpan, deadly irony as we found in Does It Matter? Because, of course, it is true. The ways of God must indeed be, by definition, as it were, strange to us here on earth. But as a response to the soldiers' sufferings, the bishop's reply, the ways of God are strange, is clearly presented by Sassoon as evasive, a cop-out, a failure, unacceptable and inexcusable from a man in his position. The poem was written in October 16, and Sassoon says it was after a long evening with Robbie Ross, Moore Adey, and Roderick Micklejohn. And he adds quite a nice little anecdote, telling how later he went on to show the poem to another friend, Eddie Marsh. Eddie Marsh was PPS to the Prime Minister at the time, so Sassoon went off to Downing Street to take it to him. And then on the way back, whom should Sassoon pass in the street but the very same bishop as in the poem? And in the anecdote, although not in the poem itself, Sassoon identifies him as the Bishop of London, who, Sassoon says, turned a mild, shining gaze on me and my MC. Sassoon does seem to have been particularly offended by the pontification of bishops. Here's another one. Vicarious Christ, and again, I'll make it slightly bigger. The Bishop of Bygum was an old friend of our general. In fact, he knew him out in the Sudan. He preached to our brigade, and the impression that he made was astounding. He was such a Christian man. He compared us to the martyrs who were burnt alive and strangled. Oh, it made us love the war to hear him speak. The Americans, he said, are coming over in large numbers, and the Huns are getting weaker every week. The Bishop of Bygum has preached on victory, I'm certain, though I haven't seen it mentioned in the press. But when I was his victim, how I wished I could have kicked him, for he made me love religion less and less. Well, that one is in Rupert Hart Davis's collection of war poems, 1983. But in Siegfried's lifetime, it appeared only in the Cambridge magazine in 1919. It certainly makes point, although it's probably nothing like as polished or as sharp as the other ones I've read. This sermon that Sassoon describes here, it also figures in the final chapter of Schurston's Progress, although that date, 1919, shows that the poem must have been written first, in fact, quite a bit earlier, since Progress didn't appear till 1936. In the account in progress, in addition to what's in the poem, Schurston, Sassoon, provides some pretty precise context. The sermon was preached at a church parade in the village of Saint-Hilaire, which is pretty much halfway between Calais and Béthune, on the 7th of July, 1918. Those details, in their turn, are taken directly from one of Sassoon's notebooks from 1918, which is now in the Cambridge University Library collection. So, apart from anything else, we've got a nice succession of texts there. The sermon itself, Sassoon's notebook, the poem, Schurston's progress. Well, Bygum, of course, well, as far as I know, Bygum is not a real place. But there's a detail which is omitted from Schurston's progress, but is included in the notebook and in the poem, which pinpoints the real life identity of this bishop. The Bishop of Bygum was an old friend of our general. In fact, he knew him out in the Sudan. So Bishop Bygum was in fact this man, Llewellyn Gwyn. Gwyn had been a missionary in Africa, and he was indeed Bishop of Khartoum from 1908 until the outbreak of war, whereupon he returned home and joined the army as a chaplain. And in 1915, Gwyn was appointed Deputy Chaplain General of the army in France with the rank of Major General. At the time of the sermon, Sassoon and his battalion were recently back from Palestine. And so the Deputy Chaplain General evidently saw it as his duty to update the men on the situation on the Western Front, hence the reference to the Americans. Siegfried clearly was not impressed. In fact, the bishop seems to have got so far under his skin that, well, it's rather as if Sassoon could hardly believe what he'd heard and needed to convince himself that it did actually happen. Sassoon had to write it down in his notebook. He went through point by point a summary of the sermon. And having convinced himself that it did happen, he carries on about Gwyn himself. The bishop, he says, is a well-nourished Anglican gramophone. Today he gave us one of his well-worn records: patriotism, insular imperialism, Hun hatred, all with a strong favour of the Morning Post and the Bishop of London somewhere in the offing. There he is again, the Bishop of London, somewhere in the offing. Well, Vicarious Christ isn't one of Sassoon's best-known poems, perhaps because it's not one of his best, simply. They, on the other hand, is very well known. But in contrast to the detail that accumulates, or Sassoon accumulates, around Vicarious Christ, it's rather oddly, I think, unclear as to whether Sassoon actually ever heard the Bishop of London preach in person, certainly in the terms that he describes in the poem, They. Max Egremont, in his biography, says it was a diatribe by Robbie Ross that evening of conversation at Half Moon Street in London. That's what sets Sassoon off against the bishop. And it does sound, to me at least, from the way that Sassoon talks about it, as if, as much as anything, the poem began life as a sort of performance to be shared between friends, rather than as a calculated intervention in public life. In Sassoon's favour, it is true that the Bishop of London was widely criticised both during and after the war for his belligerent views. In the bishop's favour, others have argued the criticism wasn't entirely fair. All I can add is that none of the newspaper descriptions that I found so far of the bishop's sermons in 1916, and I have read quite a few, fits particularly well with Sassoon's poem. Most of them, around about that time, were about the home front. He was leading, as he saw it, a great crusade to clean up our country in order to make it fit for the boys to come home to. During the war years, this was the Bishop of London, a man called Arthur Winnington Ingram. Somehow, deservedly or not, for Sassoon, Ingram had come to stand as what you might call the archetype of archiepiscopal cant. So just to finish on, it's a nice twist to discover that some 20 years previously, it was this same Ingram by whom the secrecy was confirmed. Right.
Thank you very much. A lovely twist. Well, lovely in some sense of the word. Right, this should be an opportunity for people to ask questions or make comments if they'd like to. I find it ironic that, having said Sassoon very rarely uses the pronoun you, we had 3 poems where he used it. And I think in Does It Matter? He's also sliding between an outside audience and talking to himself, because they're coming in from hunting and gobbling muffins and eggs, of course, is his world. We're talking to somebody who might well be himself. Let's hear from somebody else.
Meg, do you want to turn your video on so we can see you again?
Should you wish to, yes. There we are. Yes, Vivian. Vivian, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
We're all doing it.
Marcello, I don't understand the grammar of the 4th, 5th and 6th lines of Farewell to a Room.
Marcello, could we have it up on the screen again, do you think?
Marcello.
Sorry, I'm talking to myself.
It's just that it seems a repeat structurally of the first 3 lines, but I don't understand how it works grammatically, because room, your tranquil toned interior seems part of my own self, but then we get light while I stand outside you in the night, shutting the door on what has housed so much. Nor hand nor eye nor intellect could touch. I can't work out what the grammar of that is. What can't hand or eye or intellect touch? The light.
I think the objects.
I think it might help if we could have the text of the poem up on the screen.
I think Marcello's, it sounds like Marcello's having trouble with his connection, actually.
Right.
I took it that he was addressing light. Why, I don't know, but that's how I read it.
Yes, but what then nor hand nor eye nor intellect could touch?
I thought that was probably in opposition to much, and that he'd just left out the relative pronoun. I can't remember the exact
I cut out
word.
there. Sorry, I lost lost connection. So did you answer that for me, Meg? Sorry, I lost connection halfway through that.
Making a suggestion that nor hand nor eye nor intellect touch just refers to much, so much which could not be touched by hand.
Yeah, that's what I was explaining. Then realised I was explaining it to myself because I lost connection. that's how I would read it. I think
so it's an incomplete sentence, unlike cell and room.
Yes. I know this poem better.
Yeah. I would say so.
You know what? I once made the mistake of saying to my Latin tutor at university that we were looking at a poem of Catullus, and I made the mistake of saying to her, I think Catullus was having an off day when he wrote this poem. And I've got this feeling maybe Sassoon was having a bit of an off day. And that maybe grammar didn't always matter too much to him.
No.
I think it's just archaic grammar rather than poor grammar.
But there's no main clause.
No, that's true.
Whereas there is in room and cell.
Well, I mean, it's not, I'm gonna have to turn my camera off because I'm getting this signal going. I mean, it's not, the sentence actually goes on, doesn't it, to the end of the first paragraph. So, you know, you could argue effectively that the main clause, which would make it then a complete sentence, occurs later, or you could, you know, you could argue that the nor hand nor I nor in touch simply leaves out object, you know, touches a transitive verb, and that somehow that ellipsis works because of the, as Deb is saying, it's sort of poetic privilege to play around with rules. And in fact, I would say, because we're talking about it, that's the interest, isn't it? It's almost done.
Right.
Chris, you've done a study of places where Sassoon lived. Does this poem say anything to you? Oh, obviously that didn't work.
I don't think Chris has got his mic on.
Right, do we have some other comments and questions? For example, on Paul's piece.
I always enjoy listening to Paul because he's got that kind of blunt, Sassoonish voice, if you know what I mean, that goes so well to him. I mean, Sassoon himself didn't talk like that, but I always like listening to Paul.
I'll take that compliment, Deb. Thank you.
I love the way Paul rummages around in this rogues gallery of various unsavory people who were around in 1914-18 and were attacked by Sassoon and Owen.
I'm afraid I missed Paul's punchline on who exactly was confirmed by the bishop. It was his last line. Could he just enlighten me on this last point?
As I understand it, Winnington Ingram presided at the service where Sassoon was confirmed.
Sassoon was confirmed. Ah, it was actually Sassoon himself. Ah, that's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it was in St Paul's Cathedral, wasn't it? From memory, 1903.
There we go. Thank you.
Oh, right. Yes. Ah, good. Thanks, folks.
Yes, I mean, after I'd finished writing my little piece there, I found that actually I wanted to go back and I haven't got time, but I think it is interesting to compare the two bishop poems that I did there. One of them clearly is so very, I don't know what the right adverb is, but it's so very solidly rooted in an actual event. And the other one sounds as if it is, but actually I can't quite confirm it, except that it came quite clearly, as Sassoon says, via that evening with his friends. But how much direct experience Sassoon had of listening to the Bishop of London speak, and whether he realised that the Bishop of London was indeed the man that who had crossed his path all those years before, I don't know. So yes, the line of texts sort of stretching away into the future from the bishop speaking right through to progress, and then my own small effort 50 years later, 100 years later. There you go.
Do you have any more questions or comments?
I suppose it's natural that Sassoon should have seized on the bishops in a way, because there were examples of authoritarian control in the country, weren't they, really? It was like seizing members of the government. When he eventually realised what was actually happening during the war and the sheer horror of it, which, you know, he describes, I think he says somewhere he was rather slow on the uptake with this. And from his conventional background, he would be, I suppose. You know, he expected you to go out there and fight and win, and you're courageous, and you're the important person. But I can see him turning around and seizing people, and bishops would be people he'd go for, I would imagine.
It was certainly in the public eye, yes.
Yes, yeah.
So were politicians. I mean, again, the more I think about it, the more intriguing it is that in they, the bishop is not named and is clearly a sort of an archetype, as I said, of maybe of all bishops or all people of that particular persuasion. Whereas the Bishop of Bygone immediately sounds like a sort of a Roman à clé. This is a code name for somebody who is real, and anybody who has come across him will recognize it. It's a slightly different kind of context.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although he says he's been put off religion by this encounter, only somebody with an instinct for religion would mind that much.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can I just say something about you, Meg? Not you, as in pronoun you.
Go on.
There you go. Because I did just it come up in all of our talks actually. Paul spoke of does it matter? You in Aftermath and me in Farewell to Room. And I'm also mindful of the paper you wrote, which discussed the pronoun in Does It Matter as well, a while ago in the use of English. I mean, it's very easy actually now using modern corpus tools to look at questions like that about how many times does a particular word appear. And I've just had open while the last discussion was going on. I've got all of Counterattack, the collection Counterattack, just in an electronic corpus, and I can search for items and look for things and look at trends and pull poems out and come up with all sorts of weird and wonderful things at the touch of a button. It's quite remarkable actually. But you occurs in Counterattack 102 times, or versions of that occur 102 times. So I can't do it now because we haven't got even the 10 minutes it would take to do it, but I could pull out and look at how you is being used, whether it's being used in the subject or object position.
Yes.
And whether it's used generically, whether it seems more direct addressed to a reader, or combinations of those. So I wonder whether we were saying it doesn't occur very often. I wonder if in fact it does occur quite often. 102 times is a lot, but it maybe that it's more sort of subtle use, less of a sort of direct you and so on. But it'd be interesting to do that.
And you could find out also how often he used I and he.
Yeah, I could put you actually. See, can you see that?
Marcello's having trouble with his connection again.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. So this is just all of Counterattack, and you can see at least on the right hand side here are the number of instances of you. So I can just go through them.
Right, a huge spike.
Yeah.
I can on that and see what context it's in, and there it's in. Which poem that is? It Does It Matter? Yeah. See. So it's possible to do that. It'd be quite an interesting thing to do actually, just to sort of have a bit more statistics to those claims.
And to see if it were the same kind of proportion in the old Huntsman.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, what you can do, and you're not infringing any copyright here if you're just using it for your own purposes, is, and what I will do at some point, is have everything in there. So you basically got everything that Sassoon wrote, and a click of a button, you can do weird and wonderful searches to look at patterns and frequencies and so on. It's quite remarkable, really. So the most common wording in Counterattack is you can see them here. They come up, terms. So on. Anyway, that's just a bit of an interesting
we'll
one.
look forward to that. Do we have any other questions or comments?
The only thing I was going to say about the Farewell to Room, I read it as a sort of more of a quite an optimistic poem, because at the time Sassoon had not long met Glenn Blenshaw, and I think he was about to move to his next property, which was very close to where Glenn's family lived. And I think it was more that all the sort of past sad romances that didn't quite work out were all associated, or a lot were associated with that particular property. And now he was moving on to somewhere which he was being optimistic and quite happy about. That was a way you could look at it from a sort of a personal perspective.
Again, this would be an opportunity for Chris to comment, but I don't know whether he can hear me.
Meg, I'm sorry if I can just chip in. I'm going to have to leave you now.
Right. Thank you very much, Paul.
And thank you for the invitation. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you very much for coming.
Okay.
We look forward to hearing you again.
Thank you.
Bye.
I'll do my Sassoon voice if I can for Deb.
Bye. Anybody else, or is everybody just exhausted now?
Did Christian have something to say about the room
Well,
at Tufnell Street? And
I mean, it's such a long time since I wrote that article, but I do recall that, particularly in 1925, and he left there towards the end of 1925, I think, didn't he? And the relationships with his lodgers was very bad. It was a depressing time all around, wasn't it? I mean, for me, it was all summed up by that meeting when he bumped into Robert Graves and Lawrence in the street, and Sassoon describes feeling like an absolute ramshackle, which was actually quite well matched by the two ramshackle men opposite him in the street, I think. But the whole 5-year period was pretty grim. So I think I agree with Kate. I mean, I can't recall where the relationship with Byam Shaw was in sort of November 25, but I think he was feeling buoyed up at that time, and moving to Camden Hill Square was obviously positive.
Right. Any final contribution from anyone? Well, thank you all very much for coming and for staying the course and for taking part. And if any of you feel like taking a turn with this kind of thing next time, doing a short presentation on 1 or 2 poems, please let me or another member of the committee know. So meanwhile, renewed thanks to everybody, and of course, particularly to Deb. Shall we embarrass her to death and give her a clap?
Yeah. Zoom clap, Zoom applause.
Thank you, Deb. You've been marvellous.
Many, many thanks. Right, everyone. Probably time for a drink or a cup of tea. Goodbye, and see you all again soon, I hope.
Thank you very much.
Jerusalem.
Everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye, Meg. Bye.
Bye.